Growing up, I always felt like I was on the outside looking in. Not just physically, but emotionally, socially, and mentally. My name is Christopher Ellison, and for as long as I can remember, I've been different. It's not like I couldn't see other people interacting, laughing, and connecting. It's more that those connections seemed so foreign to me, like a language I was never taught to speak. When I was younger, I didn't understand why the world around me felt so confusing, why my classmates would laugh and joke with each other, yet the words they spoke and the emotions they conveyed didn't make sense to me. Social cues? I was lost. Why did people whisper and giggle when I spoke up in class? Why did my attempt at humor leave everyone silent? The more I tried to be part of the group, the more distant I felt from them. It's not that I didn't want friends, I just didn't know how to make those connections stick. I remember my first day of kindergarten like it was yesterday. Everyone else seemed so sure of themselves. The kids quickly paired off, forming bonds that I could only observe. I stood there, silent, clutching my lunchbox, wondering what was wrong with me. My teachers, though kind, often looked at me with a mixture of pity and confusion. They called it being a bit shy, but the truth was I wasn't shy. I simply didn't understand how to be normal. My brain functioned differently. I processed things differently. When others would speak in riddles or hint at something, I took their words at face value. That made me easy to overlook, or worse, an easy target for teasing. I remember the first time I was labeled as odd. It was in second grade. A girl, Sarah, had given me a pencil with a bright pink eraser, and I thought it was a trick. Why would anyone give me something that clearly wasn't theirs? I remember the confused looks from my classmates when I hesitated before taking it. When I finally did, I muttered a thank you, though it felt more like an obligation than a real gesture. They laughed at me then. Not in a friendly way, but in a way that made me retreat deeper into myself. "He's weird," I overheard one of them whisper. That word stuck with me for years. Weird. That's what I was. School was the same. I was good at math, incredibly precise. I could solve problems that others found impossible, but when it came to navigating social situations, I was hopeless. While other kids could easily join in on a game of tag, I stood by the fence watching. There was no rule book for how to play that game. My mind craved structure, logic, and facts, things that made sense. But people? They didn't follow rules, not in the way I understood them. That's when I started to understand what made me different. I had Asperger's syndrome, though I wouldn't find out until later. It was a relief to put a name to the strange feeling that had haunted me for years. Asperger's syndrome. It didn't explain everything, but it explained enough. It explained why I could talk about atomic bombs with the same enthusiasm as other kids talked about cartoons. It explained why I felt uncomfortable in crowded rooms. It explained why small talk felt like an impossible puzzle. My family tried to understand me, but even they couldn't fully grasp the way my mind worked. My mother, God bless her, tried her best. She would ask me about my day, and I'd answer with facts, details that I found interesting. But she wanted more than that. She wanted me to talk about friends, about emotions, about the feelings behind the details I gave. My father didn't know how to deal with my quiet nature, so he often remained distant. He'd pat me on the back, give me a few words of encouragement, but there was always a gap, a distance between us that neither of us knew how to bridge. I found solace in routines. The structure was something I could control. I found peace in the way numbers lined up, in the predictable patterns that made the world feel a little less chaotic. I would spend hours working through puzzles, solving equations, and diving into topics like medieval history or the physics behind sound waves. I didn't care if others didn't understand. The facts made sense to me, and that was enough. But while I could escape into my world of logic and numbers, there was one area where I couldn't hide: my relationship with people. When I was 16, I realized that I had never dated anyone. The thought of engaging in casual conversation about things like dating and relationships made my skin crawl. I had no idea how to navigate the complex world of emotions that everyone else seemed to understand so easily. Girls? I didn't know what they wanted. They'd smile at me, laugh with me, but it was all so confusing. At 18, my grandfather, seeing how awkward I was with girls, took matters into his own hands. He hired a courtesan for my birthday, thinking that a little experience might teach me how to interact with women. I remember being both horrified and fascinated by the situation. It felt like a clinical experiment rather than a date, but I did it. It was one of the strangest, most uncomfortable experiences of my life, but I kept going back for more, thinking that somehow it would help me understand how to be normal. But it didn't. It only left me more confused, more unsure about how I fit into this world of emotions and unspoken rules. What's the point of dating when I couldn't even understand the conversations that were supposed to lead to it? How could I trust a world where everything seemed so random and unpredictable? Even with all my accomplishments, even with my academic success and my scholarship to college, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was missing something crucial, something I was never going to understand. That's the thing about being different. It's not that you want to be. It's that you have no choice. You can either try to fit into a world that doesn't quite work for you, or you can try to accept yourself as you are. And for me, that acceptance came slowly, painfully, and only after realizing that maybe being different wasn't such a bad thing after all. But for that to happen, I had to find my way in a world that didn't quite get me. And at 18, I still didn't know how. As the days went by, the cracks in my marriage with Miranda became more visible, and I felt a coldness between us that I couldn't ignore any longer. I had spent years focusing on the rules of logic, on numbers, on facts. I had spent years believing that if I could master the structure of the world, I could navigate everything, relationships included. But here I was, standing at the edge of a deep, unexplainable chasm, unable to find the right formula to fix what was breaking inside my home. Miranda was everything I wasn't. She was spontaneous, passionate, and driven by emotions I couldn't fully understand. When we first met, that was part of the attraction. The way she seemed so alive with energy, so free from the constraints I felt in my own mind. But over time, that very freedom began to feel like a wall between us. She was constantly out, attending rallies, organizing events, fighting for causes that burned in her heart. She was busy, but not with me. At first, I didn't question it. I respected her dedication, admired the way she fought for what she believed in. But as the months turned into years, I began to feel the absence of her presence, not just physically, but emotionally. I would come home from work, exhausted from the mental gymnastics of analyzing financial reports and projections, only to find that Miranda wasn't there, or when she was distant, her thoughts seemingly elsewhere. I wanted to talk to her, but when I tried, I didn't know how to bridge the gap between us. I often found myself standing in the kitchen, watching her as she moved around, lost in her world. I would ask about her day, but the answers were always rushed, as if she were checking a box instead of engaging. I began to feel like an afterthought. As the silence between us grew, so did my doubts. I thought, maybe if I just pushed harder, if I tried to be more present, I could make her see me again. But the harder I tried, the more she seemed to slip away. The first real sign of trouble came when I noticed her phone buzzing constantly. Messages from people I didn't know, messages she quickly silenced when I entered the room. I told myself it was nothing. She had her work, her causes. I didn't have the right to question it. But as time passed, those little moments of unease started to build, one on top of another, like water seeping into cracks, slowly eroding everything I thought was solid. One evening I came home early from work. I was hoping to catch a moment with her, maybe share a quiet dinner, something simple. But when I walked into our living room, the conversation I overheard on the phone stopped me dead in my tracks. She was talking to someone. Her voice was soft, intimate even, in a way I hadn't heard in years. My heart began to race. I couldn't make out every word, but the tone was unmistakable. This wasn't about work. This wasn't about a cause. It was something else, something personal. I stood there, frozen in the hallway, listening as she laughed softly at something the other person said. I felt a wave of nausea roll over me. Why had I never heard that laugh before? Why did it feel so intimate? Why did it feel like I wasn't part of the world she was creating? The worst part was that I wasn't even angry yet, just numb. I couldn't process it. The structure of my mind, which had always been so reliable, couldn't handle this kind of chaos. I didn't know what to do. After she hung up, I pretended like nothing had happened. I asked her about her day, just like I always did. She gave her usual short responses, not noticing how my hands trembled as I held the coffee cup, or how my mind raced, trying to make sense of everything. I spent the rest of the evening in silence, sitting across from her at the dinner table, feeling like I was miles away from the woman I once knew. It wasn't that I didn't love her anymore. I did. I loved her deeply, but I felt like I had lost her. I felt like I had never truly had her in the first place. That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to find the words to say. But there was nothing I could say. Words felt too small, too insignificant. What did I even want from her? To confess? To admit something that might not even be true? I wasn't sure what the truth was anymore. I wasn't even sure if I would recognize it if it hit me in the face. I kept thinking, maybe I'm just imagining things. But deep down, I knew. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was living with someone who was slipping through my fingers, and I didn't know how to stop it. And then came the nights when she didn't come home at all. She would leave late for one of her rallies or meetings and return at odd hours, always apologizing but never explaining. I told myself it was just her work, her passion for her causes. But when she started missing more than just a few nights, when the words "I love you" felt more like a routine than a truth, I began to wonder if she even cared enough to fight for us. I didn't know how to fight for us either. I couldn't understand why she was drifting away, but I couldn't seem to pull her back. And it hurt, more than I could put into words. I kept waiting for the moment when everything would click into place, when she would see how much I needed her, how much I was trying to hold on to something that seemed so fragile, so broken. But as each day passed, the space between us grew larger. I could feel it. It was there in the way we sat across from each other at dinner, in the way we shared the same bed but felt like strangers. I kept hoping that maybe, just maybe one day, she would turn to me and say the words I was dying to hear. But that hope started to fade, slowly, quietly, like the last embers of a fire that had burned too bright for too long. I wasn't ready to give up yet, but I could see the cracks in the foundation of our relationship, and I knew that no amount of effort on my part could fix them. Not unless she was willing to meet me halfway. The first real signs of trouble came like small cracks in an otherwise calm surface, quiet, subtle, almost invisible at first, but as the days passed, those cracks grew, and I could no longer ignore them. I was beginning to see my marriage with Miranda for what it truly was, fractured, fragile, and uncertain. I had always believed in structure, in predictability, in the belief that if you just followed the rules, things would work out. But Miranda and everything about our relationship didn't fit into that neat little box. One morning, I woke up early before Miranda and started preparing breakfast. I did this a lot. The routine helped me feel in control, something I could hold on to in a world that constantly left me off balance. As I cracked eggs into a pan, I thought about the day ahead, the work I had to do, the things I still had to fix in the house. I could hear the hum of the coffee machine, the soft rustle of the morning air outside. But there was something missing, something that hadn't been there for a while. When Miranda woke up, she didn't greet me like she usually did. There was no good morning kiss, no light-hearted exchange. Instead, she just walked into the kitchen, barely acknowledging me. I said hello, trying to sound cheerful, but she didn't look up. She simply went about her routine, almost mechanically. Her eyes were fixed on something on her phone, her fingers scrolling through messages that she quickly minimized when I glanced over. I didn't say anything. I told myself it was just a busy morning, that she had a lot on her mind. But deep down I knew something wasn't right. It wasn't the first time she had been distant, but today it felt different. The silence stretched out between us, heavier than usual. I tried to make small talk, asking her about a rally she had attended the night before, but her answers were short, disinterested. She wasn't really there, not in the way I needed her to be. It felt like she was somewhere else entirely. Later that day, I noticed another strange thing. She had started leaving the house without telling me where she was going. I would ask, and she would reply with vague answers, "I have a meeting," or "I need to take care of something." It wasn't like Miranda to be so secretive. I trusted her, or at least I thought I did. I never once questioned where she was going or who she was meeting, but now that trust was starting to erode. I remember the day I came home early from work. I didn't plan to, just a rare break in the routine, but I needed to pick something up from the house before heading to the office. When I walked through the front door, I heard her talking. Her voice was softer than usual, like she was trying to keep the conversation private. I stood there in the doorway, my heart hammering in my chest. She was on the phone with someone, laughing at something they said, the sound too familiar, too intimate for my comfort. I couldn't hear every word, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. The tone in her voice wasn't just casual, it was something else, something I hadn't heard in a long time. I could feel the ground beneath me start to shift, the foundation of everything I thought I knew about her crumbling beneath my feet. I didn't know what to do. I stayed there, frozen, as she continued her conversation. I wanted to interrupt, to confront her, but something kept me from doing it. Maybe it was fear. Fear of hearing the truth I didn't want to know. Or maybe it was the realization that I had already been drifting apart from her for so long that it didn't even feel real anymore. When she hung up, she didn't notice me standing there. I pretended everything was fine, but the silence that followed felt louder than any argument we could have had. I asked her how her day was, as I always did, but her response was as hollow as ever. It wasn't just the words, it was the way she spoke them, distant and detached. She wasn't angry with me, she wasn't upset, she was just gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts spinning in circles. I kept asking myself the same question. What happened? Where did we go wrong? I tried to trace it back to the moment things began to shift, but it was hard to pinpoint. Was it when Miranda started getting more involved in her activism? Or was it when I began to retreat into my work, lost in the structure of numbers and reports, too focused on logic to see the cracks forming right in front of me? I wanted to talk to her, to ask her what was happening, but I was terrified of what she might say, terrified that I wouldn't be able to fix it. I didn't know how to communicate what I was feeling. I didn't know how to tell her that I missed her, that I felt like I was losing her. She wasn't the woman I married anymore. She had changed, and I had failed to see it. Or maybe I had been too afraid to admit it. The more I tried to convince myself that everything would be okay, the more I realized that something was broken. It wasn't just a small issue I could fix with a few words or gestures. It was something deeper. And no matter how much I tried to control everything around me, there was no formula for saving a marriage that was slowly slipping away. I didn't want to face it. I didn't want to believe it. But deep down I knew I was already losing her. It was in the quiet of the night, when everything seemed to slow down and the world around me grew still, that I first caught a glimpse of the truth. A truth I had been avoiding, suppressing, and convincing myself wasn't there. But in that one moment, everything changed. I had been on edge for weeks, but that night felt different. I had spent the evening as I always did, working late, catching up on emails, organizing numbers in spreadsheets, trying to keep myself busy. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't ignore the tension, the silence that had started to creep into our home, the emptiness that lingered between Miranda and me. That night, she came home late, as she had done so many times before. But this time I wasn't pretending everything was fine. I couldn't. Something had shifted, something was wrong, and I needed answers. I heard her footsteps in the hallway, the soft click of her shoes on the hardwood floor, but it didn't feel like home anymore. It felt foreign. I could tell by the way she walked that she was still distracted, her head in some distant place I couldn't reach. When she stepped into the kitchen, she didn't even notice me standing there. Her eyes were glued to her phone, fingers scrolling, her lips slightly parted, as though lost in a conversation with someone far away. I cleared my throat, trying to get her attention. "Miranda," I said softly. She looked up, startled, as if she hadn't even realized I was there. Her face softened for a moment, but it was a fleeting expression, like a shadow passing quickly through a storm. "Hey," she said, her voice hollow. like it didn't even belong to her. I watched her for a moment, waiting for her to say more. She didn't. Instead, she dropped her bag on the counter and continued scrolling through her phone. The silence between us was deafening. I wanted to ask her what was going on, but the words caught in my throat. What was I supposed to say? How could I ask her something I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer to? And then, just like that, something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to let this go on any longer. I had spent so many years ignoring the signs, convincing myself that everything would be fine if I just kept pushing forward. But the reality was sinking in, slowly but surely. She was slipping away, and I wasn't sure how to stop it. "Who are you talking to on the phone?" I asked, my voice shaking with a mixture of fear and anger. I could feel my pulse quicken, the room closing in around me. Miranda's eyes widened, and for a split second I saw something I hadn't seen in months. Guilt? Fear? It disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by her usual nonchalance. She looked at me, unfazed, as though my question didn't even matter. "Just a friend," she said, her voice flat. But there was something in her eyes, a flicker of something I couldn't put my finger on. It wasn't just a friend. It never was. My mind raced, trying to make sense of everything, but the truth was already there. It was right in front of me, so obvious that I couldn't ignore it anymore. "Miranda," I said, my voice barely a whisper now, "I need to know the truth." She looked at me then, and I saw a crack in her facade. She hesitated, her eyes darting away from mine as though searching for a way to escape the moment. But there was no escape anymore. The walls were closing in, and the truth was inevitable. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, her voice breaking for just a moment. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." I could feel my heart drop in my chest. The words she spoke hit me like a punch to the gut, and for a brief moment everything around me went silent. "What are you saying?" I asked, my voice hoarse, barely able to hold itself together. Her eyes met mine then, and there it was. The truth. The truth I had been denying for so long, hoping it wasn't real. "I've been seeing someone else," she confessed, her voice small, almost a whisper. "I didn't mean for it to happen, but it did." The words echoed in my head and I could barely breathe. I had heard it, but it didn't make sense. I wanted to scream, to yell, to ask her why, but I couldn't. The pain was suffocating, the hurt too overwhelming to express. I took a step back, my legs feeling weak beneath me. "How long?" I asked, barely able to form the words. I didn't know if I wanted to hear the answer. Part of me hoped she would lie, but I knew better. She didn't say anything at first. Instead, she looked at me, her eyes full of something I couldn't place. Guilt? Regret? Or maybe just the resignation of someone who had already made up her mind. "It's been months," she finally said. "I didn't know how to tell you. I thought I could fix it, but I couldn't. I'm so sorry, Chris." Sorry. The word rang hollow in my ears. I couldn't look at her anymore. The woman I had loved, the woman I thought I knew, was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. I turned away, my hands trembling at my sides. "I need some time," I whispered, my voice cracking. And then I left the room, leaving her standing there, alone in the silence. It's strange how one small moment, one small decision, can shift the entire course of your life. The evidence that changed everything came to me in the form of an innocent-looking piece of paper, one I never would have suspected. And yet, when I saw it, it all made sense. It confirmed what I had felt in the pit of my stomach for so long, the gut-wrenching truth that I hadn't wanted to believe. I had spent the last few days in a fog. Since Miranda's confession, I hadn't been able to think clearly, let alone feel. I was numb, stuck in a loop of confusion and disbelief. I wanted to be angry, to scream at her, but I wasn't even sure where to begin. It felt like I was drowning in a sea of emotions, unable to grab hold of anything solid to keep me afloat. Everything about her, about us, suddenly seemed false. That morning, as I sat at the kitchen table sorting through papers and old receipts, something caught my eye. It wasn't the type of document I usually handled, but it was familiar enough. A phone bill. Miranda's phone bill. I had never been the type to snoop through her things, but that day something inside me shifted. It was as if my hands had a mind of their own, driven by an unspoken need to uncover more. I unrolled the bill, the numbers blurring as I scanned through it quickly, looking for any sign that could tell me what I didn't want to know. And then, there it was. A list of calls, repeated calls, long conversations. One name stood out to me, highlighted in bold letters on the list. David. I had seen the name before, but it hadn't clicked at the time. David was one of her colleagues, a man I had met once at a fundraiser, but I had never thought much of him. But now, as I traced the numbers back, I realized just how many times Miranda had spoken to him in the last few months. It was more than casual. It was intimate. The calls were late at night, at odd hours, moments when she should have been with me, with us. My breath caught in my throat as I continued to read. The length of the conversations, the laughter in the late-night calls, it all painted a picture I didn't want to see. This was more than just a friendship. I could feel the betrayal like a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. The silence in our home, the coldness between us, all made sense now. This wasn't just about Miranda growing distant. This was about something far deeper, something I wasn't prepared for. I didn't know what to do with this information. I wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but I wasn't ready. Not yet. Part of me still hoped that this was a misunderstanding, that there was some logical explanation for these late-night conversations. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. It was exactly what it looked like. The first hard evidence, the proof I had been avoiding for so long, was finally staring me in the face. I felt a wave of dizziness, the room spinning as if the floor beneath me had suddenly given way. I stood up, unsteady, holding onto the table for support. The truth was undeniable now. Miranda had been lying to me, hiding something from me, something that I couldn't explain away or rationalize. The woman I had trusted, the woman I had loved, was now someone I didn't recognize. And yet, I still wanted to hold on to her, to fix it, to make everything right. But how could I fix something that wasn't broken by me? How could I make sense of a situation where the person I trusted most was the one hurting me? As I sat back down, the paper trembling in my hands, I realized I had reached a point of no return. There would be no going back to the way things were. No more pretending. No more ignoring the cracks that had been there all along. I had the evidence. The truth was no longer a distant feeling or a vague suspicion. It was real, and it was undeniable. I stared at the phone bill, the weight of it heavy in my hands. The finality of it hit me hard. There was no more room for doubt. I had to face this. I had to confront her. But even as I reached for the phone to call her, to demand an explanation, I hesitated. What was I going to say? What could I say? I wasn't prepared for what I would hear. I wasn't ready to hear her explain how she had fallen out of love with me, how her heart had gone somewhere else. The seconds stretched into minutes as I sat there, the phone still in my hand, my mind a blur of emotions. What do you do when everything you've known, everything you've believed in, falls apart? When the truth you never wanted to see stares you down, unrelenting and harsh? I didn't have an answer, but I knew one thing for sure. The man I was before this moment was gone. The man who trusted and believed in the woman he loved was no longer the same, and from that moment on, nothing would ever be the same again. The moment I had dreaded, the moment I knew was coming, was now unavoidable. The truth had been laid out before me, undeniable and cold, and I couldn't push it back anymore. The evidence was there, her words, her actions, the name on the phone bill. It all pointed to the same thing. Miranda had betrayed me. I stood in the kitchen that evening, the phone bill clenched in my hand, my knuckles white from gripping it too tightly. The paper trembled between my fingers as if it could somehow escape what it had just revealed. The quiet hum of the refrigerator filled the room, a stark contrast to the pounding of my heart. Every part of me screamed to walk away, to ignore what I knew, but I couldn't. I could feel Miranda's presence behind me, her footsteps tentative as she approached. She must have known something was wrong. Maybe she was just waiting for the confrontation, or maybe she didn't know how to face me either. Either way, this was it. There was no more hiding, no more pretending. "Chris?" Her voice broke the silence, soft and hesitant, like she was afraid to disturb the fragile air between us. I didn't answer. I couldn't. What was there to say that hadn't already been said in the silence? What could I say that would change anything? Slowly I turned to face her. She looked the same, beautiful, radiant even, but in her eyes there was a flicker of something I hadn't seen in months, guilt, regret, fear. But there was something else too, something I had never seen before in her, distance. "Chris," she repeated, her voice trembling now, "I'm so sorry I never wanted this to happen. The words were too familiar, too hollow. They meant nothing. I had heard them before from others, and they never held the weight they were supposed to. They never healed the hurt. They didn't fix the damage. I didn't trust myself to speak at first. What could I say? What was the point in asking her why when I already knew the answer? What was the point of asking her to explain when the truth was clear and I had already seen the depth of it? Instead, I held up the phone bill. The silence stretched between us as I watched her face fall. Her eyes dropped to the paper in my hand, then back up to meet mine, and I could see the mask slipping. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't the woman I had known. She wasn't the wife I had loved. "David," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "You've been talking to him for months, every night, late at night." Miranda opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She swallowed hard, her throat constricting as if she were choking on the truth. I could see the fear now, raw and unfiltered in her eyes. She had no excuses. She had no explanation that would make this right. She was caught in a web of lies, and there was no way out. "Chris," her voice was soft now, pleading, "I didn't mean to hurt you. I never wanted to hurt you." The words felt like a knife in my chest, twisting with every beat of my heart. I had trusted her. I had loved her with everything I had, believing she was the one person who would never let me down. And now, here we were, standing on opposite sides of a chasm that I couldn't cross. The woman I had given my life to was standing before me, and yet she felt like a stranger. I shook my head, the anger and hurt building inside me, but I couldn't let it out. Not yet. I couldn't let the rage consume me. Instead, I just stood there, staring at her, my eyes burning with the weight of everything that had just shattered. "Did you love him?" I asked quietly, my voice almost steady, though the question nearly killed me to ask. "Or was it just something else? Something I couldn't give you?" Her silence spoke louder than any words could. She didn't have to say it. I could see it in the way she avoided my gaze, the way she shrunk back as if ashamed. Her hesitation said it all. I wasn't enough. I hadn't been enough for a long time. I don't know," she murmured, almost to herself. "I never meant for this to happen, Chris. I swear, I still love you. I never stopped loving you." But I couldn't hear those words anymore. They meant nothing. They were just words. Empty, useless words that couldn't fill the hole that had been torn in my chest. I dropped the phone bill onto the counter, my hand shaking. I couldn't look at it anymore. I couldn't look at her anymore. My thoughts were racing, spinning in chaotic circles. How had I missed this? How had I not seen the signs? Or had I seen them and I just didn't want to believe? I didn't know anymore. All I knew was that nothing would ever be the same. "I think you should go," I said, my voice low, barely above a whisper. Miranda's face crumpled. She looked as if she wanted to say something, to explain, but I couldn't bear to hear it. Not now, not after everything. "Chris, please." She reached out to me, but I stepped back, shaking my head. "Just go," I said, my voice firmer now. "I need space. We need space." She stood there for a long moment, as if waiting for me to change my mind. But I didn't. I couldn't. I couldn't let her stay, not when everything between us had already died. I watched her leave, the door clicking softly behind her, and as the silence settled into the room, I realized that I had lost her, and I didn't know how to get her back. The silence after she left was suffocating, like the air had been sucked out of the room. It was the kind of quiet that makes you question everything you thought you knew. I had asked her to leave, and she had. Now all I was left with was the hollow echo of the life we had built together. A life that in a single moment had unraveled before me, like a thread slowly pulling away from the fabric of what I once thought was real. It was a strange feeling, knowing that the woman I had loved, the woman I had trusted with everything, was now a stranger. She was out there, somewhere, living her life while I was stuck in this limbo of confusion and pain. I had never imagined that I would be here, making decisions I never thought I'd have to make, decisions about our future, about the end of everything we once shared. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair across from me, the place where she had sat every night. I kept seeing her face, her smile, the way she'd laugh, the way she used to hold me when we both fell asleep. But those memories felt distant now. They felt like they belonged to someone else, someone I didn't know anymore. A part of me wanted to reach out to her, to ask her to come back, to pretend like none of this had happened. But I knew I couldn't. The trust was gone, and once it's gone forever. The phone bill, the late-night calls to David, the way she'd shut down every conversation we tried to have, it all came rushing back to me. I had spent so many days trying to make sense of it, trying to understand how we had arrived at this point. I tried to reason with myself, tell myself that maybe I had been too distant, that maybe if I had been more understanding, more present, she wouldn't have felt the need to seek affection elsewhere. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the truth. It wasn't about what I did or didn't do. It was about the choices she made and the way she betrayed me. I picked up my phone, dialing a number I had never wanted to dial, the lawyer's office. As the phone rang, I felt the weight of the decision settling on my shoulders, heavy and cold. When the receptionist answered, her voice polite and businesslike, I could barely find the words, but somehow I managed to speak. "I need to file for divorce," I said, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. "I don't think there's any other way." The silence that followed felt like a void. There was no turning back now. The decision had been made. There was no easy way to undo the hurt, no way to fix what was broken. I could feel my chest tightening, my breath shallow as the reality of what I was doing began to sink in. It felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down into the darkness below. The path forward was uncertain, but I knew it was the only choice I had left. The next few days were a blur of paperwork and meetings, of legal jargon I didn't fully understand. I went through the motions, my mind numb, my heart heavy. I thought about the kids, Sophia and Lucas, and how this decision would affect them. The thought of them growing up in a broken home was almost unbearable. But I knew that staying in a marriage built on lies wasn't the answer either. They deserved better than that. They deserved to see what real love looked like. Miranda hadn't tried to reach out to me, not in the way I had expected. She hadn't called, she hadn't even sent a message, and in some ways, that hurt more than anything. I wanted her to fight for us, to show that she cared, to show that she was willing to put in the effort to fix the damage she had done. But she didn't. She had made her choice, and I had to make mine. The night before I was supposed to meet with the lawyer again, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about everything we had shared, the good times, the bad times, the moments when we had laughed together, when we had dreamed together. But those memories felt like ghosts now, haunting me, reminding me of what we had lost. I wanted to believe that there was a way to fix things. I wanted to believe that love could heal everything. But the truth was that love wasn't enough when trust had been shattered. And no matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise, I knew deep down that this was the only way forward. When the day came, I walked into the lawyer's office with a sense of finality that I hadn't felt before. It was as though a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I was making the hardest decision of my life, but it was also the one that had to be made. I was done living in the shadow of what used to be. I was done pretending that everything was okay when it wasn't. The lawyer handed me the papers to sign, and I stared at the words for a moment, letting them sink in. Divorce. The end of a chapter. The end of everything I thought I knew about love, about family, about happiness. But as I signed my name at the bottom of the page, I realized that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something new. And as I left the office that day, the weight of the decision still heavy on my heart, I knew that I had done the right thing. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't painless, But it was necessary. For me, for the kids, for all of us. The first night in the house alone was the hardest. The emptiness seemed to stretch endlessly around me, suffocating me in a way that was impossible to describe. I lay awake in the same bed we had shared for years, but everything felt wrong. The sheets felt colder, the space beside me felt emptier, and the quiet was deafening. I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing, replaying everything that had led me to this point. How had we gotten here? How had it all fallen apart so quickly? I had thought that once the decision was made, once I filed the papers, I would feel a sense of relief. But instead, all I felt was a crushing weight of finality. There was no going back now. The life we had built together was over, and there was no way to rewind the clock to when things were simple, when we were happy. I found myself staring at her side of the bed, wishing for a moment that she would walk through the door, apologize, and say she wanted to make things work. But I knew that wasn't going to happen. That woman, the one I had fallen in love with, was gone. In her place was someone who had betrayed me, someone who had made choices that left me with no option but to let her go. The house felt like a stranger's. The walls, once familiar, now seemed cold and distant. I wandered through the rooms, picking up things that no longer felt like mine, things that reminded me of a time when I wasn't so alone. I picked up a picture frame from the living room, a photo of us from one of those carefree vacations before everything had started to unravel. We were smiling, so happy, our arms around each other like we were invincible. I ran my fingers over the glass, wishing I could go back to that moment when everything was simple. But I couldn't. I couldn't pretend anymore. The next day I did what I had to do. I told the kids. Sophia, my daughter, was old enough to understand, and when I saw the look of confusion on her face, it broke me. She didn't cry, but I could see it in her eyes, the confusion, the fear. She didn't understand why things had to change. I wished I could explain it to her, tell her that everything would be okay, that nothing would be the same, but we would find a way to move forward. But I didn't have those answers. I didn't know how to fix this, how to make her feel safe again. Lucas, my son, was too young to understand the complexities of what was happening. But he felt the change. I could see it in the way he clung to me, the way he asked me if Mommy was coming home. His little face, so full of hope, broke my heart. How do you explain to a child that the woman who had been their mother, who had been their world, was now someone who had made a choice to leave, to walk away from them? I couldn't find the words. Later that day, I walked around the house trying to figure out what to do next. It was like I was in a fog, unable to see clearly, unable to focus. Every corner reminded me of Miranda, of the life we had shared. Her perfume still lingered on the pillows, her books sat on the shelves, the dishes she had used were still in the sink. The house felt too full of her, too full of the memories we had once shared, memories that now felt like a weight on my shoulders. I had spent so many years building my life around this woman, around this family, and now it was all gone. The future we had planned, the dreams we had shared felt like they had been shattered in an instant. And I didn't know how to move forward. How do you rebuild when everything you've known has crumbled? How do you find the strength to keep going when the very foundation of your life has been ripped out from under you? I found myself sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the papers in front of me. The divorce papers, the legal documents that would officially end my marriage. They were a formality, I knew. They didn't change the reality. Miranda was gone, and so was the life I had known. But there was something about those papers that made it all real. Signing them felt like I was erasing a part of myself, like I was giving up something I had fought so hard to keep. But I knew there was no other choice. The cold reality was that I couldn't keep holding on to something that had already slipped through my fingers. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay when it wasn't. The woman I had loved had made a choice, and so had I. It was time to move on, even if I didn't know what that looked like yet. The kids needed me. I needed to be strong for them. But how could I be strong when I felt so broken? How could I be the father they needed when I didn't even know how to fix myself? I put the pen down and signed the papers, the weight of the decision pressing heavily on my chest. The sound of the pen against the paper felt final. This was it. It was over. And as I signed my name, I realized that this wasn't the end of everything. It was just the beginning of something else. I didn't know where this path would lead, but I had no choice but to walk it. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was the only one I had left. The first time I walked into the lawyer's office, I felt like I was stepping into a battlefield. It was strange, this mix of dread and necessity that hung over me, knowing that what I was about to face wasn't just legal, it was personal. It was my life being dissected, my heart, my family, my entire future on the line. The door closed behind me, and the sound echoed in the room like a warning. I sat down, the weight of everything pressing against my chest. The lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Linda, sat across from me, her gaze sharp, focused. She had seen this before, I could tell. She had dealt with men like me, men broken by betrayal, men forced into a corner. But this wasn't just any case for me. This was my marriage, the family I had built. And now it was crumbling. I handed her the papers, divorce documents, custody forms, a few short sentences that would change everything. "We'll need to fight for custody," Linda said as she flipped through the papers, scanning them quickly. Her voice was steady, professional, but I could see the flicker of sympathy in her eyes. She wasn't looking at me as a client. She was looking at me as a man who had lost something irreplaceable. "I don't want to fight her," I said quietly, feeling the weight of the words settle between us. "I just want to do what's right for the kids. I want them to be okay. I want them to feel safe." Linda didn't respond immediately. She sat back in her chair, eyes narrowing as if processing what I had just said. She knew what I meant, what I was really asking. I wasn't just asking for custody of my children. I was asking for the chance to rebuild a life, to salvage whatever dignity I had left. "The courts will focus on what's best for the children," she finally said, her voice soft but firm. "And right now it doesn't look like she's offering stability. Your children need structure and they need consistency. If she's out of the picture, emotionally at least, the court may lean in your favor." I nodded, but it didn't ease the pit in my stomach. I had spent the last few weeks questioning everything I thought I knew. Did I really know Miranda? Did I ever really know her? I kept imagining the look on Sophia's face when she found out, how I would explain to Lucas why Mommy wasn't coming home. These were the moments that broke me, the reality of what was happening sinking in, each day deeper than the last. The battle was beginning, and it wasn't just about property or assets. It was about my children, my family, my life. And for the first time, I realized how little control I actually had. Miranda had already made her choice. She had left. She had betrayed me. But what hurt the most was how easily she had walked away, leaving me to pick up the pieces of our children's lives, of everything we had built together. The first few legal meetings were a blur. Each time I met with Linda, I felt like I was being pulled further away from the man I used to be, further away from the life I had hoped to have. The papers, the signatures, the endless negotiations. It was all so impersonal, so clinical. I would leave each meeting feeling like I had just been part of a transaction, not someone's heart and soul laid bare on the table. I kept thinking about Miranda, about the way she had once made me feel safe, loved, needed. It wasn't just that I missed her, though I did. It was that I missed the idea of us, the idea of family. I missed being a unit, being whole, but that wasn't what I had anymore. All I had now was the cold reality of a life divided. It was in the middle of one of these meetings when I began to question everything. The lawyer had sent over the preliminary custody agreement, and I found myself staring at the words, seeing them but not understanding them. My head was spinning. I wasn't just battling for my children's future. I was battling against a ghost, a version of Miranda that no longer existed. "She's not the woman I married," I said to Linda, my voice thick with emotion. I hadn't realized how much I had been holding back until the words spilled out. "She's not the woman I thought I knew, and now I'm fighting for my kids. I'm fighting for them, not her." Linda nodded slowly, her expression unreadable, but I could see the understanding in her eyes. I wasn't just fighting for custody of my children. I was fighting for my own sense of self, my own piece of the life we had lost. I wasn't just asking for what was right. I was fighting for survival. "You'll have to be strong," she said, her voice steady but carrying a weight that I hadn't noticed before. "This isn't going to be easy. It's going to get worse before it gets better. But I'm here to help you through it." And in that moment I realized just how much this would change me. The fight had just begun, and no matter what happened, no matter who won or lost, I was no longer the same person. The man I had been was gone, swallowed up by this cold, relentless reality. I had no choice but to move forward, for the sake of my children, for the sake of whatever family we could still be. The days had become a blur. Each one felt like a mirror reflecting the one before, a constant loop of pain, anger, and the overwhelming weight of everything that had fallen apart. But it was during the most ordinary moment of the next week that the deepest secret of all came to light. The one that had been buried beneath layers of lies and deceit. I had been sitting in my office at home, surrounded by paperwork, legal files, and the remnants of a life that no longer felt like mine. It was a late afternoon when I received an unexpected call. It was from a private investigator Linda had hired, someone who had been digging into Miranda's background and, more specifically, into the time she had been spending away from the house. I hadn't asked for it, hadn't expected it, but somehow, the need for the truth had become consuming. I had seen Miranda's secret calls to David, but there was something in me that kept asking, what else? What else has she been hiding? The investigator's voice was calm and professional. He told me he had uncovered some information, things that had slipped through the cracks, and he believed it was time I knew. At first, I was hesitant, unsure of whether I wanted to know more, but something inside me told me I had to face whatever was coming. Whatever it was bigger than I had imagined. The words he spoke next sent a shiver down my spine. "Mr. Ellison, your wife, she's been involved with someone for longer than you think, and not just with David." I was silent for a long moment, my mind trying to process what I was hearing. The cold, hard truth that had been building up over the weeks now felt like a tidal wave about to crash down on me. "Who else?" I finally managed to ask, the words tasting bitter. The investigator hesitated as if unsure of how to break the rest of the news. "There's more," he said. "She's had a relationship with someone connected to your business, a man named Peter. He's been in your office. He's attended meetings with you. He was with her in places you wouldn't have guessed." I felt like the ground beneath me had suddenly given way. Peter. He was someone I had trusted, someone who had been close to me, close to my work. He had been at events with me, shared professional moments with me, and all the while he had been entangled in a secret relationship with my wife. It wasn't just a betrayal of our marriage, it was a betrayal of everything I had believed in. The investigator continued, detailing meetings between Miranda and Peter, some of which had occurred in hotels and places that were clearly meant to be hidden. There was no mistaking it anymore. This wasn't a simple affair. This wasn't a brief fling. This was a long-standing deception that I had been blind to, buried in the mundane, everyday rhythms of life. It was almost as if the world had stopped. My breath felt shallow, my heart beating erratically in my chest. I had known something was wrong, but never in my worst nightmares had I imagined this. Miranda's betrayal was so deep, so intricate, that it made everything else seem insignificant. "I'll send you the full report," the investigator said, his voice tinged with sympathy. "I think you need to see this, Mr. Ellison. It's important." I hung up the phone, my hands trembling. I stared at the screen, trying to make sense of the chaos inside me. How could she? How could Miranda, the woman I had trusted, the mother of my children, do this to me? To us? I didn't want to look at the report. I didn't want to face it. But I had to. The truth, ugly as it was, had to be faced. I opened the file, scrolling through the documents with a mixture of dread and resignation. There it was, the cold truth laid bare in black and white. The picture it painted was one of calculated deceit. My mind raced as I processed the implications. How long had this been going on? How much had I missed? How many signs had I ignored because I didn't want to see? The man I thought was my friend, my colleague, had been part of the secret that shattered everything. The life I had worked so hard to build had been torn apart by the lies of the people I had trusted the most, And in that moment, I realized that this was no longer just about a failed marriage or a broken trust. This was about my entire identity being questioned. The pillars that had held my life together had crumbled, leaving me with nothing but rubble, and all the while I had been blind to it. I thought about the kids. How would they understand this? How could I explain it to them in a way that wouldn't scar them? I could feel the weight of their future pressing on me. This wasn't just my pain anymore. This was theirs too. The doorbell rang, pulling me out of my thoughts. It was Linda, arriving to discuss the next steps in the legal battle. I hadn't expected it, but the timing seemed almost fitting. I needed to prepare for the war ahead, the one that wasn't just about custody of the kids or the division of assets. This was about the war for my own soul, for my own understanding of who I was. I took a deep breath, wiped my eyes, and opened the door. The secrets had been unveiled, and now there was no going back. The battle for the life I had once known was just beginning. The first few weeks after the divorce felt like I was walking through a fog, unsure of where I was going or what I was supposed to be doing. The house, once filled with the noise of daily life, was now too quiet, too empty. There were no more arguments, no more tense silences between Miranda and me, but there was also no more laughter, no more casual conversations. Just silence. I had thought that after everything had been settled, the custody arrangements, the division of assets, the legal battles, I would feel a sense of closure, a sense of relief that it was all finally over. But what I didn't realize was that divorce doesn't bring closure. It just opens a new chapter, one that's full of uncertainty, full of questions you never thought you'd have to face. The kids were with me every other week, but those days were the hardest. I could see the toll it was taking on them. Sophia, my daughter, tried to act like everything was fine, but I could see the sadness in her eyes. The way she would sit by the window, waiting for Miranda to come pick her up, even though I told her she didn't have to. Lucas, too, was affected, though in ways he couldn't understand. He didn't have the words for it yet, but I could see the confusion in the way he clung to me, afraid that I would leave him too. When they weren't with me, the house was an even bigger void. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the sound of my own breathing, but there was nothing else. No voices, no movement. The stillness was a constant reminder of what I had lost. It was a cruel reminder of the life I once had and the future I would never have. I spent a lot of time thinking about Miranda, about the woman she had become and the woman I used to know. The betrayal she had caused still weighed heavily on my mind. Every time I thought I had let go of the hurt, it would come rushing back, and I would wonder how she could have done this to us, to me. The anger I felt was sharp and relentless, but so was the sadness. It was as though my heart had been cracked in two, and I was struggling to hold the pieces together. I tried to distract myself with work, with the mundane tasks that once felt so simple. But nothing felt the same anymore. The drive, the focus, the passion for what I did, it was all gone. Work had once been my escape, my safe space, but now it was just another reminder of how far I had fallen. It was hard to concentrate, hard to stay present. My mind kept drifting back to the life I used to have, to the family I used to have, and to the future that now seemed so uncertain. I began seeing a therapist. At first I didn't want to, didn't believe it would help. But I needed to talk to someone, needed to say the things I had been keeping locked inside for too long. The sessions were awkward at first, me sitting there, unsure of what to say, but slowly, it began to help. I started to unpack the pain, the anger, the confusion. Slowly I began to understand that it wasn't just the betrayal that hurt. It was the loss of the life I had imagined, the loss of the future I thought was mine to build. The divorce had torn apart not just my marriage, but my identity. I had spent so many years building my life around Miranda, around our family. Now, I had to learn who I was without that. I had to figure out who I was, what I wanted, and how I could move forward. It felt impossible some days. Some days I wanted to crawl back into bed, pull the covers over my head and disappear, but I couldn't. I had to be there for my kids. I had to keep moving forward, even if I didn't know how. It was a slow process. There were days when the grief felt overwhelming, and I wondered if I would ever feel whole again. But there were also moments, small victories, where I saw glimmers of light, when Sophia would laugh at something silly I said, or when Lucas would run to me with a big hug. Those moments reminded me that there was still love in my life, still joy to be found, even if it was in small doses. I started to date again, something I never thought I would do. It was awkward at first, meeting new people, trying to find someone who could understand the man I had become. But it was a step forward, a step toward healing. It wasn't about replacing Miranda, it was about rediscovering myself, finding a way to live again. But even in the moments when I felt like I was beginning to heal, there was always that nagging voice in the back of my mind, reminding me of what had been lost. I could see the future in front of me, and while it was uncertain, it wasn't as bleak as it had seemed in the beginning. I wasn't sure where I was going, but I knew one thing for sure: I had to keep moving forward. Life after the divorce wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but it was mine to rebuild. And as I began to find my footing again, I realized that while I couldn't change the past, I still had control over my future. That was something I had to hold on to. It wasn't like any fairy tale romance the way things started with Janet. There were no fireworks, no grand gestures, no moments of fate colliding. It began quietly, like the steady rhythm of the rain after a storm, soft and slow, giving me the space I needed to breathe again. After everything had fallen apart, after the betrayal, the legal battles, the soul-crushing days of being lost in the rubble of a broken family, I hadn't expected anyone, least of all Janet, to enter my life again. I met Janet in a way that seemed almost too ordinary to be significant. She was the friend of a colleague, someone I'd crossed paths with at events, someone I had exchanged pleasantries with in passing. At first, there was nothing special about her. She wasn't the type to stand out in a crowd, not in the way Miranda once had. But as the months went by, I started noticing her in ways I hadn't before. The way she would smile just a little too brightly when she saw me. The way her voice held a warmth that felt like sunlight breaking through a cloudy sky. One night, after a long day of work and a weekend spent in a haze of grief, I found myself sitting across from Janet at a quiet cafe, the kind of place that seemed far too intimate for casual conversation. She had invited me out for dinner, something light, she said, just to talk. And talk we did, for hours. There were no distractions, no silences, no uncomfortable moments. It was easy to talk to her, easy to forget the weight of the past. "I know this sounds crazy," she said halfway through the evening, her hands clasped in front of her as she looked at me with an intensity I hadn't expected. "But you don't have to keep pretending you're fine. It's okay to be broken. It's okay to feel the way you do." I had been holding everything in, pushing my emotions down in the hopes that if I didn't feel anything, nothing would hurt. But hearing those words, so simple yet profound, made me want to let go of the walls I had built around myself. I couldn't remember the last time someone had looked at me like that, with understanding, with patience. The thing was, Janet wasn't like the others. She wasn't offering me advice or pity. She wasn't there to fix me. She was just there, listening, offering a space where I could be honest. And that honesty, about the pain, about the hurt, about the pieces of myself I had long ignored, was a kind of freedom I hadn't realized I needed. We started spending more time together, taking long walks in the evenings, having coffee on lazy Sunday afternoons. It wasn't a whirlwind romance, not at all. It was slow, steady, a quiet kind of healing that began when I least expected it. With Janet, I didn't feel like I was living in the shadow of my past. She didn't remind me of my failed marriage, of the things I had lost. She was something new, a fresh start. And as much as I hated the idea of being the kind of person who needed someone else to fill the hole left by the past, I realized that she wasn't filling anything. She wasn't replacing Miranda. She was just offering me a chance to start again, to find my way back to a life I had thought I'd lost forever. There were moments, though, when the pain of what I'd been through crept in. It wasn't easy to forget the years of betrayal, the shattered trust. It wasn't easy to pretend I wasn't still scarred by the decisions Miranda had made. And sometimes, when I looked at Janet, I would feel a wave of guilt for even thinking about moving forward, for even thinking about loving someone again. But Janet wasn't asking me to forget. She wasn't asking me to rush into anything. She was asking me to take my time, to let the process unfold naturally. She understood. She had seen the darkness in my eyes, the way my smile didn't reach my heart, and she never pushed me. One evening after we had finished dinner, Janet reached for my hand. Her touch was gentle, and for the first time in a long time I didn't feel the urge to pull away. I let her hold my hand, and it was like I was learning how to trust again, how to be vulnerable without fear. "I'm not asking you to forget," she said softly, her thumb brushing the back of my hand. "I'm not asking you to rush. I just want you to know that I'm here. If you want to take this slow, if you need time, that's okay. I just want to be a part of your life." Those words stayed with me long after the evening ended. I wasn't ready to jump into something new, not yet. But I knew deep in my heart that Janet was the first step toward healing. She was a new chapter, a chance for me to rediscover what it meant to be loved, to love again. Days turned into weeks, and the time I spent with her continued to feel like a breath of fresh air. We shared our stories, our laughter, our silences. And in those moments I realized that a new beginning was possible, that even after everything, I could still find peace. I could still find love. And it wasn't a love that replaced what I had lost. It was a love that helped me rebuild, piece by piece, what had been broken. And as I looked ahead, I saw a future that, for the first time in a long time, seemed full of promise. What do you think of Chris and his journey through betrayal and healing? From which region are you watching this video? Make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to follow all our stories. And don't forget to check out more heartwarming tales by clicking here on the end screen.